Structure Let us start the presentation and panel discussion sessions on science diplomacy. First of all, Dr. Baek Seo-in from the Science and Technology Diplomacy Policy Research Department at STEPI will give us a presentation. Dr. Baek Seo-in has been analyzing global innovation environment and exploring policy alternatives to strengthen science and technology innovation. Today, he will introduce global trends regarding science and technology diplomacy based on his expertise on environmental changes and global innovation. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Please give him a big hand. Good afternoon. My name is Baek Seo-in, as was just introduced, working at STEPI. First of all, I'd like to thank all the guests and participants for being with us today. So as for the topic of my presentation, I will talk about global science and technology and innovation policy and science diplomacy trend. And as for the table of contents, I'll firstly touch upon the background. Why science and technology and innovation policy becoming more important when we think about this? Mainly, it's because of globalization. In the past, most globalization was about the globalization of markets, where we produced and trade goods. But now we are seeing the global production. We saw global production network and its globalization, and now we are seeing the globalization of innovation. And in that process, in the past, usually raw materials and industrial products and transportation mattered in the era of globalization of trade. And in the era of globalization of production, labor cost regulation agreements became important. And in the globalization of innovation era, human capital infrastructure and data are important factors. Now we are seeing the outbreak of COVID-19, and we are still in the process of overcoming the pandemic. And in this era of challenges, what's more important is resilience, robustness, and international relationship. And the semiconductor industry is very important in this era. And the industry is very strictly divided across the countries around the world. And as for the global value chain of Apple, for example, it has more than 1,000 providers over 45 countries. And as for venture capital, which supports and invest in the core sectors of startup companies and technology companies, they are much weaker, and they are becoming much more interdependent. So we can say it's becoming highly specialized and becoming more interdependent. And from the diplomacy perspective, science diplomacy is becoming more important. And also that's mainly because emerging security challenges. We often talk about game-changing technologies, which include AI, machine learning, deep learning, 5G and 6G, quantum technology are being fast developed and being extensively and widely applied. And most of these game-changing technologies are dual-use technologies as well, which brings about security issues. And we are seeing rapid shift and seeing more connections between things and human, as well as personal data and industrial data. And the importance of this intangible data is becoming ever more important. And more recently, semiconductor, battery, and natural resources are becoming more difficult to have the supply. So this is another area that we need to focus more on research. And let me talk about trends. So as for the U.S., since the Biden administration, the U.S. passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which aims to strengthen overall competitiveness and plans to invest more in their science and innovation industries. So these acts and packages are about semiconductor production. It also includes Endless Frontier Act and Strategic Frontier Act. And the act includes increased investment in core industries and strengthen its relationships with core allies. So especially centering around core ally countries, the U.S. is planning to expand their relationship and cooperation. So as for the core industries, AI, machine learning, semiconductor, and many other important cutting-edge software and computing technology areas. And as for China, it started that 14th five-year plan and 2035 mid to long-term strategy. So in this era of heated competition between China and the U.S., China seems to continue its strategy to expand its investment in R&D and some other basic science areas. And as for the core contents of this 14th five-year plan, the country aims to expand investment into core technology areas, aiming to provide more government support, and also it aims to continue to nurture science talents. So China seems to focus more on nurturing a human talent in the field of science and technology. And as for the EU's industrial strategy, first of all, we can talk about the single market and their focus on the importance of single market. So the EU is stressing the importance of 14 industries and the importance of single market. So they continue to analyze their relevance and dependency on technologies and on relationships with other countries. And also, it's actively trying to switch to zero emission policy. So this slide shows the technologies included in science and technology innovation policy of the 5 main countries. So most of the countries are focusing on AI, 5G, quantum computing, biotechnology. And as for the US and China, they are actively investing in these core areas. And as for Korea, Korea is also focusing its strategy on most of the areas listed in this slide. And now I'd like to touch upon science diplomacy trend. And as for the definition of science diplomacy, I wouldn't go into detail as I can imagine that you are all very aware about the definition of science diplomacy. So we mostly talk about 3 aspects. As for the definition of science diplomacy, which are science in diplomacy and diplomacy for science and science for diplomacy. So science is fast developing and changing, and diplomacy and international relationship are becoming ever more important. So science and its relationship with diplomacy is also becoming more important. So science diplomacy is changing and is gaining more and more importance, which is because technological innovation and international relationships are going through fast and significant changes. So Sustainable Development Goals, COVID-19, Fourth Industrial Revolution, and these are the reasons why science diplomacy is becoming more important. SDGs are key driver to science cooperation for global challenges. These goals themselves are difficult, but not mandatory. So it's becoming more burdensome for countries to put efforts to achieve sustainable development goals. And as for the fourth industrial revolution, the impact of it on science diplomacy is also changing. And now we are also stressing the importance of transparency, openness, and ethics of the fourth industrial revolution. So this is one of the changes that we are faced with. And another factor we need to think about is the impact of COVID-19. So this pandemic has revealed the importance of international relationship and cooperation, as well as science diplomacy. And depending on whether we, as a country, have the capability to respond to this pandemic, we are seeing the vaccine polarization and vaccine diplomacy. So I'd like to talk about science diplomacy of the U.S. So the effort is mostly being led by the State Department in the U.S., but I see that many initiatives in this regard. So one of the representative programs include Embassy Science Fellow Program and U.S. Science Envoy Program. So overall, these programs intend to further expand the capabilities in the field of science. And as for science diplomacy of China, they tend to be somewhat different from that of the U.S. So mostly the science diplomacy efforts are being led by the diplomats that are dispatched and working across the countries around the world. So in the past 5 years or so, they've seen more outcomes derived from these efforts led by the country. And also, the Chinese government's efforts have been more about filling the gap within the capabilities that they have in the country. And we are seeing more active science diplomat service actions as well. And these actions are more focusing on task-oriented and countries' programs are aimed at discovering, demand, and deriving international cooperation outcomes and the importance of the culture and science as well. As was mentioned in the remarks, science diplomacy in Korea was also mentioned briefly. Korea announced a science diplomacy strategy in 2019, and the purpose of the strategy is to create safe life for the people and to achieve globally shared growth and create making contributions to international community and also enhancing the quality of life, etc. And after the launching of the strategy back in 2019, many industries across the government have focusing on catching up with the following outcomes. I think as the result of the efforts, we are seeing more outcomes these days. And as for the implications, which will be the last part of my presentation, currently, science diplomacy and innovation efforts are becoming more important. However, we are faced with a growing level of uncertainties, challenges, and missions. That's because the markets are changing rapidly, and also international relationships and the systems are clashing against each other. And that's mainly because we are still working on this global pandemic. The risks coming from the global pandemic are not over. So we need to come up with new diplomatic model and concept to tackle the current tasks. Most of the countries in Korea are trying hard to tackle these external factors by coming up with their own unique strategies, and the core capability will come from their own innovation efforts. And secondly, the future core technology and new growth drivers and industry growth drivers will be very important. And we need to analyze what the risks and growth opportunities coming from this new changes in the environment. This ends my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
네, 백서민 박사님 발...
Yes, thank you for that presentation. The presentation was about
과학기술 외교의
So he talked about the definition of science diplomacy, and he also touched upon the trends of nations around the world. So I think he gave us good ideas to continue to talk about in the group discussion and panel discussion session as well.
어,
So we heard the presentation, which was more of an overview. Now we will have a panel discussion that touches upon the different trends in different countries around the world. And we have the science officers from the embassies who are really the men in action, really, at the forefront of science diplomacy. So we will discuss various issues and challenges and trends, and we'll exchange ideas and have really fruitful discussions. So since science diplomacy in action is our keyword today, and it is our topic, that are in Seoul. So I think we are ready to begin. As we introduced earlier, we do have from the embassies of Australia, UK, Sweden, Germany, and Denmark. And they will share their progress and challenges in science diplomacy, each about 7 minutes each. We will have the presentation in the seating order of our presenters. So first, from the Australian Embassy, we have the Defense Science and Technology Counselor, Mr. Daniel Billing. So let us hear his presentation. And I believe he shared his presentation with us in advance. So let's take a look at the material as we listen. Please welcome him.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So my name is Dr. Dan Billing. I'm the Defence Science and Technology Counsellor at the Australian Embassy here in Seoul. I was the first Defence Science and Technology Counsellor from Australia posted to Republic of Korea, which I think underscores the increasing importance of science diplomacy in the world at the moment. I'd firstly like to thank the Science and Technology Policy Institute for coordinating this important forum, and I enjoyed Dr. Beck's presentation just a few moments ago. And one of the reasons why I enjoyed Dr. Beck's presentation is that he also used this taxonomy of science diplomacy, which in Australia we think is a wonderful way to frame what we do at our international posts. And so the discussion points that I will raise today about Australia's national approach to science diplomacy will be around this framework. And I just wanted to highlight before I start to discuss these three areas is the interdependency between all three. They are self-supporting, and No one is more important than the other, but collectively they can make a significant difference. So firstly, let's talk about science in diplomacy. And one of the best known examples of a science advice mechanism for informing policy making is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC is a scientific panel established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme. The purpose is to provide the world with a clear scientific view of the current state of climate change and its potential environmental and socio-economic consequences. Thousands of scientists from all over the world contribute to these reviews and periodic assessments on a voluntary basis, which are then used for global policy discussions. Now, what's critical in regard to this is that these scientists will inform the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference commencing next week in Glasgow, Scotland. And in particular in Australia, scientists have been researching the best approach to inform Australia's emission reduction targets. And most importantly, science and technology will be used to reach some of the emission reductions targets, such as clean hydrogen, energy storage and carbon capture and storage. So science and technology will lead Australia's ability to meet the emission reduction targets. Okay, the overall goal of actions under the Diplomacy for Science category is to benefit from international science and technology resources in order to improve national capacity. So as shown on this slide, Australia has developed a booklet called Partnering with Australia on Innovation, Science and Research to engage the international science and technology community. This booklet outlines a range of opportunities for international organisations and individuals to partner with Australia on cutting-edge innovation, science and researchers. It's used extensively by our global network of science and technology counsellors to engage with the home countries. It showcases Australia's credentials and gives information on Australian government initiatives supporting international innovation, science and research connections. A specific initiative is the Global Science and Technology Diplomacy Fund. The Global Science and Technology Diplomacy Fund is designed to be a strategic, flexible and streamlined approach to supporting international science and research collaboration. This fund was announced in the Australian Government's 2021-22 budget, so it's a very recent announcement, and has a total allocation of $57.6 million over 4 years, with $8.2 million available every year after that. In terms of practical programs, Australia and Korea ran the first Technology Bridge or Tech Bridge event last month here in this very room. The objective of this event was to build people-to-people links in future-focused technologies of mutual strategic interest. The theme of this year's event was particularly topical. It was focused on the applications of artificial intelligence to counter infectious disease, and it brought together leading experts from these two disciplines in each of our countries. And these researchers who have formed completely new links are now in the process of developing project proposals that will see them working together to solve this important issue, global pandemics, or to contribute to this important issue in the coming years. So finally, science for diplomacy. Science and technology serves as the key device in diplomatic relations between countries. High-level forums, such as the recent Foreign and Defence Ministers 2+2 meeting held last month here in Seoul, allowed Australia and Korea to set the future direction for its defence science and technology cooperation. And the slide in front of you has an extract from the formal set of outcomes from this meeting. And you'll note that in these outcomes, one of the key achievements is in fact multilateral and trilateral cooperation in particular between Australia, Korea and the US. And Australia increasingly view the ability to work together, not just bilaterally, but multilaterally, is really critical to overcoming some of the challenges we face. Now, I know in the opening remarks, the Artemis Accords was referred to, and it is a terrific example of science for diplomacy. Korea and Australia are both signatories to the Artemis Accords, and the Artemis Accords describe a shared vision for principles grounded on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Finally, to mark this year's 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Australia and Korea, we've initiated a series called the Korea Conversations. Professor Tanya Munro, Australia's Chief Defence Scientist, pictured here on this slide, who's also my boss, delivered a speech as part of this series last month that covered the current state of the relationship and future growth opportunities. And these engagements, albeit online, provide an excellent way to work together to come to identify areas of mutual strategic interest and progress initiatives under those key disciplines. So I'll conclude my remarks there.
Now, let me give the microphone to British Embassy Seoul. Mr. Gareth Davis, Head of Science Innovation from the British Embassy Seoul, is with us today. Mr. Davis, you have about 7 minutes.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here today and to share the UK's point of view on science diplomacy. I think what's often seen as a little different perhaps around the UK's approach to science diplomacy is we don't have a formal published science strategy. It's something that's been largely inherent in our foreign diplomacy for a very long time. And so for the UK, this is essentially a structurally inbuilt capability that we have developed over a very long time. And I think that looking at that structure is particularly important and valuable. So I'll share a little bit on that before touching on a couple of major initiatives. So I think that the first thing that the UK has, which I still believe is unique globally, is that we have a structure of chief scientific advisors into all of our government ministries in the UK, including a governmental chief scientific advisor who advises our Prime Minister directly. Now, these chief scientific advisors have essentially a dual role. Firstly, they are there to ensure that the government is being provided with the highest quality possible scientific advice and evidence into its policy making, but they are in their own right people who will travel and they will share and they will work with other countries in order to deliver common interest and bilateral partnerships. And that goes for not only the chief scientific advisor who sits in our foreign ministry, but all the way through to the chief scientific advisors who would sit in ministries that are not perhaps well known here in Korea. So for example, for our Department for Work or Pensions or for our Ministry of Defence, you wouldn't commonly think that these are people working internationally, but they are, and it's their role. I think one of the other things that we're very fortunate to have in the UK, and it's essentially where I come from as far as the embassy is concerned, is we have had for a long time the UK Science and Innovation Network, and this is a formal group of diplomats and local country employees who are there having a role dedicated in bilateral and multilateral science collaboration. Here in Korea, we're a team of 4. We work across a range of different subject areas, from basic and early medical research through to hard and applied artificial intelligence. And our role is there to cover off all of the taxonomy of science diplomacy, whether that is assuring that we are helping to tackle global challenges, whether it is talking about how we can collaborate in ODA for science and technology overseas. But this is a really important structure that enables us to make sure that we are offering to our partners around the world the values that the UK is seeking to achieve and the initiatives that we're seeking to achieve. And I think that there's a couple of important and more domestically focused structures in the UK system that are worth sharing on as well. And the first is, inside the Prime Minister's office, we have a new division called the Office for Science and Technology Strategy. Now, this is a structure that is there to pull together the strategic development goals of the UK. Obviously, we have technological challenges that are being faced around the world and by the UK, and that team is there to work across government to make sure that all of the opinion of government in the UK is shared, but also to see how we can project those goals out into the global space, whether that is seeking to work within multilateral structures for development. We've heard about SDGs, and of course, very importantly right now, into the World Health Organization, or whether it's into bilateral relationships, or whether it's looking at how we can attract the best companies and talent from around the world into the UK to support our own development goals. These are all things that are wrapped up as part and parcel. And lastly, and this is a really interesting one as well, is that we have a Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. So these are experts from across the technological and scientific spectrum. It's chaired by the Prime Minister, co-chaired by our governmental chief scientific advisor. And as you look at the reports that are coming out of those discussions, every single meeting that we see something come from, it's talking about how do we engage internationally on these subjects. And it ranges from truly technical challenges. For example, how do we get into global standardization of ethics within AI and data security? How do we ensure that flow of information is properly done in a way that protects the citizenry? But also to how do we work on big international scientific projects such as the ITEF International Fusion Project. All of these things, it's built in, it's baked into the system. And so it's not really a strict consideration of each and every single thing in separate nature. As already mentioned, it would be really not very clever of me to not mention the fact that we will be hosting probably the world's largest science diplomacy conference starting this weekend in Glasgow. At COP26, we're seeing I think a very, very large number, I think 150, 160 leaders from around the world coming together to address what is essentially a science diplomacy challenge. And it doesn't matter which bit of the taxonomy that you are looking at. And I think that the UK approach to this challenge here is knowing, very importantly, that we can't do it alone, that we need to work with our international partners for the delivery of COP26, and that it is everybody's responsibility to do as much as they can in order to support that particular important engagement. And whilst my team has really only been looking at a particular component of that, and I'm very pleased to say that the vice chair of the Presidential Advisory Council on Science and Technology has signed up to the science statement that will be published very shortly. The climate change team at our embassy has pulled together everybody from a range of different subject areas: finance, nature, looking at the energy sector, looking at the different subsets of everything that's going on at COP26, and in every single aspect of that there is a science diplomacy question that needs support and cooperation. And it is only through the other countries adding together and the UK's convening power of these questions get answered. And so I think it's really important that as we look at how we take global science diplomacy forward, we look at what is happening at COP26 as a model for how things should be done. A smaller part of COP26 is mission innovation, or at least it's a component of the discussions going on. Mission innovation was established at Paris COP, the COP21. It was initially an initiative that was put forward by the US and France in cooperation. Korea, the UK, and I think probably most of the countries represented here are signatories to that. And this is now headquartered in the UK. And our role here is now to look at the specific technological requirements in response to the science diplomacy challenge of climate change. So I think in essence, all of that leads to really sort of driving home the point that diplomacy science diplomacy is a massively important tool. And I think that the approach that we're taking in the UK has evolved over time of one of diplomacy for acquisition and knowledge, and more of one on how to attack and take on the challenges that are being brought forward. And I saw the very interesting list of technologies that Dr. Beck put on in his presentation on all of the different technological focuses that the countries have. Every single one of those technologies brings with it its own challenges, its own risks, its own security issues. And by working together, we're going to be doing all of that. So I think that, yes, I think the most important thing that we can be looking forward as we look at science diplomacy in the future, the most important thing we can be looking at is we really cannot be looking at science diplomacy as a method of acquisition. It doesn't work anymore. It has to be one of collaboration, co-development, and mutual understanding. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Yes, thank you for that presentation. I think he pointed out very important points about science and technology diplomacy in the UK. And he mentioned that it's not just a method, but it goes through all important fields, and how science diplomacy has an impact on other areas as well. The third panel is from the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul. We have Mr. Anders Hector. He is currently the Science and Innovation Counselor at the Swedish Embassy. So I would like to ask him for his presentation. Thank you.
박수로
Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to take part of what STEP is doing in this area, and also to listen to colleagues. We get too few opportunities, so thank you for that. Of course, science diplomacy is more important than ever right now, maybe always, but it feels like it's more important than ever right now, and getting more important as well. So this is our perspective from the Swedish point of view. I'm assuming it's a perspective that's being shared by many with different strength or weight, you can say. On the one hand, we have the technological interdependence, which is a need, or it's a reality rather. It's the situation that we live in. During the COVID, it has become very clear. And on the other hand, where there is a tension, there is a need or a desire for some level of strategic independence, as opposed to the interdependence. And the question is, how is it possible to reconcile these issues? Even Sweden, being part of the European Union, have these needs or desires that can be based in strategic competition or competitiveness. We have some companies that we are proud and happy to have in Sweden, and we want them to continue to grow and to be strong. So in that sense, we have some interest in independence, but the independence can be, of course, different for other countries. And then there are constant changing factors to this tension field, this reality. There can be geopolitical or technological. Many times they are science-based in one way or another. And I have as an example here green transition, which is, at least for Sweden, an area that is very much affecting how the government is working right now. I'm speaking with my colleagues at the Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation or other ministries in Sweden, and I learn, just to give you a little bit of a color, that they are tremendously busy these days, more busy than when I myself left the ministry a couple of years ago. And the question is, I thought it was because of the COVID, but it's actually not. It's because of the green transition that is taking place. Because there are so many different factors that are being affected by this, with the requirements for permissions and new actors coming in, things opening in areas of the country where they haven't been before, with a big need for electricity, things like that. So the Swedish government is tremendously busy by this change that's taking place from green transition. And within this bigger field or blob of green transition, of course, you have many different specific technologies or areas like hydrogen or container freight or consumer requirements for green energy, company requirements for green energy, and how we're supposed to deal with that. So that's the question: how can we reconcile these tensions? And our perspective is that strategic collaboration is, of course, the way to go to do that, to approach that. And we see that it's the same as other countries are doing as well. South Korea, of course, as well. We need the strategic collaboration in order to deal with, not overcome or perhaps reconcile, but to deal with these changes, the changing conditions, the facts of the technological interdependence, and how to manage the strategic independence. And independence is an interesting area, actually, because I don't really believe that it's possible with independence within science and technology, because the better quality and the better price and the better innovation are often somewhere else. So we need to collaborate with those, and we need to be pragmatic and realistic. And that's the Swedish perspective, and that's how we're working on it. And it is both for international and national level or perspective in a macro fashion, you can say. We have, if we look at the international level, outside of the R&D policies that we have, we are collaborating through embassies and Business Sweden, which is the import-export supporting function, that also have like an innovation mandate, you could say. Not mandate, but innovation request. Yeah. And the Office of Science and Innovation that we have in a number of countries, 7 countries. UK is the last office to open, actually. And we are, of course, working with conventional issues like presence in important environments and bilateral programs and so on. And also with the idea that it's everything macro is micro in some sense. It's all people that it comes down to. We need to collaborate on a people level. So having people like researchers meeting, conversing and sharing is what we need to achieve to move forward. Nationally, science diplomacy is actually something that's very important nationally, because that's where it starts. And if it's not working nationally, then it's not working internationally either. And a very Swedish approach is to focus on the triple helix, to have all parts of society, particularly collaborating with companies. That's tremendously important for us. Building on each other's strength in bilateral relations, in relations between the government and companies, inviting companies to the conversations on innovation, like the Prime Minister is chairing a National Innovation Council, and we have something we call innovation partnership programs in a few different specific fields where several companies are participating, up to 100, in conversations with the government and government agencies. Here in Korea, I know the situation is quite different when it comes to the relation between companies and the government, and that's so unfortunate, because you need to have an open and free, trusting conversation, you know, without risking the ocularity of being too close or anything like that. I think it's a key to the future for Korea as well. So these are the core activities, and this is the different areas that we're focusing on. We're also worth mentioning is the Fossil-Free Sweden, which is a private-public partnership inquiry, you can say, where the government and companies are meeting to discuss green transition and how companies can be fossil-free, can achieve fossil-free competitiveness, how they can innovate to become next generation green companies that can put green products on the world market, like the Swedish steel company SSAB have delivered already green steel. And Volvo is the first customer, and they're producing trucks made of green steel. It's already a reality. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I've probably spoken too long already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You are just on time. So now let me invite the fourth panelist, who is from German Embassy, Seoul. So let me invite Mr. Alexander Renner, Counselor for Scientific Affairs from a German Embassy in Seoul. Please welcome him with a big hand.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's very good to be here. We're working together with Steffi for many years now, and so it's really good to be on this forum today. I'm a little bit in a difficult situation right now, because I could double or third or fourth now a lot of things which have already been said, and that's not what I want to do. So I tried a little bit to explain maybe what I try to do here in Korea, and maybe focus a little bit on what is good and what is bad running. So science for diplomacy, let's start with this. I skipped the part science in diplomacy. I think everything is said to that already. I'm talking about science for diplomacy. Climate change, yes, it's for sure and a big focus of the German embassy as well. But we have done other events as well. For example, we did with the Seoul National University, rectifying past wrongs and remembrance culture in Korea and Germany. So a topic like this is science diplomacy for us as well. It's not just about technology. It's very important to understand that the German approach to science technology, and I guess it's more or less the same in all of these countries, is probably wider than the Korean one. I mean, Korea is always talking about technology and innovation in the field of technology, and at least for Germany, innovation is more than technology, but innovation is a society can be innovative, and that does not just mean that you have a new technology. So maybe that explains another event we had here in Korea. This is a few years ago already. You know, the German law system and the Korean law system are very similar. There's this long tradition of having big exchanges to topics of law. And you probably know also that in Germany, as all in Europe, same-sex marriage is an important topic. So we had, for example, an event here in Korea about the change which has to happen in the law system to allow same-sex marriages. All of this is science diplomacy for us. And I think it's very important to understand. This is not just about technology. Diplomacy for science. I could talk now about the typical fields which are important for exchange as well, like artificial intelligence, climate change, hydrogen economy. These things have been said. But a big part of my reporting to Germany is scientific freedom, for example. What's happening here? How big is the Chinese influences on Korean research institutions? What happens if the people in Hong Kong are rallying and Korean students are doing rallies as well and Chinese students try to stop them? This is important for us. This is important to keep an eye in science diplomacy on scientific freedom. And this is important to understand. Another, we want to be active for international talents as well in Germany. This is another part I'm doing here. We try to promote the German science system, so Koreans come to Germany to study or to do research there. And you probably know that the Max Planck Institute won 2 Nobel Prizes this year and 2 Nobel Prizes last year also, or researchers are doing research. So. And the most important maybe for us was not won by a German, but by a French lady. But she is doing research in Germany. And this shows us how strong the German research system is, how attractive the research is, and that our science diplomacy is working and attracting talents from all over the world to Germany. This is another example. So what else? Yes. And another point I want to make and I want to stress, even when we talk about technology and maybe like nature science, this is more than product development. I always had the feeling that in Korea, when we talk about research and development, about 80% at least is development. And the part of research, even applied research, is relatively small. But this brings us very often a difficult position for cooperation projects, because this development is something which is classically done in Germany and I guess all over Europe in the industry, by industry companies, and it is not something which is steered by the state. This is steered by the enterprises themselves, by the companies themselves. We focus, with most other countries, quite strong on basic research and on applied research. But Korea is mostly interested in development. This is a difficult situation, and you can see this. We have these big research organizations in Germany, like Max Planck, like Leibniz, like Fraunhofer. And just Fraunhofer has an office here in Korea. They are responsible for development and applied research. For an institution like Max Planck, Korea is not that interesting. Korea is not investing enough in basic research. There was a step in the right direction when the IBS institutions were founded, but again, they focus very strictly on technical questions. Even in basic research, the Max Planck Institution is doing research in all fields, in the humanities, in the social sciences, and so on. So these are kind of the troubles we have when we talk about cooperation between the two countries. So they are big opportunities, because Korea is one of the most innovative countries in the world. Basically every index shows that. But Korea is not strong or not very focused on doing basic research, on doing breakthrough innovations in the field of research, but it's rather specialized in developing a product further to make a product better. And Korea is very, very good in this, don't get me wrong. But for me, as a science counselor, this is also kind of a problem. I hope that was understandable, what I said. Okay, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much.
Now, last panel is from the Embassy of Denmark's Innovation Center Denmark in Seoul. We have with us the executive director of this center, Mr. Peter Fengsbo.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, panelists, for very, very insightful actions in what you see around science diplomacy in action. I will continue my presentation with the word action. How do we do this in action with our partners here in Korea? As mentioned, my name is Peter Fengsbo. I'm from the Innovation Center in Denmark. And please allow me to give you a very brief about what is our Innovation Center and how have it been created. The Danish government sees science as a door opener for global partnership. Science diplomacy is all about partnerships. Our Danish government have decided to really strengthen science diplomacy in 7 selected countries, the most progressive, innovative countries in the world. And this is why we have chosen Korea. This is why we have established an innovation center here in Seoul. Our innovation center is an integrated part of the embassy. We have a team of 9 people working to create concrete platforms where we can establish public-private partnerships, where we actually can show our children how does it look like, how does innovation look like, and how can we integrate public engagement, set different agendas, discuss about research and science, but also try to bring in our export into our programs. One of our most prestigious science action together with our Korean partners was the P4G partnership which was hosted here in Seoul in May. More than 45 different countries participated in this global action for global partnerships. And P4G is a core example on how we can develop interaction and science diplomacy between the wealthy world and also the less developed world. How we can focus on creating projects together, exploring our different cultures, and how we can learn from each other between North and South. It was an amazing event hosted by MOFA in May, and we managed to establish 25 different global science diplomacy activities. One of the ideas we are trying to push is a very concrete example in Korea with the province of Chukchok-Namdo. We have been looking into the Korean New Deal. What is the core focus on bringing science and civil society together in the Korean New Deal? We saw that energy retrofitting of public building could be that step. So we have created a partnership with Chukchok-Namdo about how we can energy retrofit public schools. And when we are doing this test of technologies in school, we are also creating a platform for how the students, the children, they can actually see their own carbon footprint. They can actually learn that their action matters. They can learn about technology. They can learn about how they can measure their own CO2 footprint. So we are combining science with education, with partnership and promotion of existing technologies. This is for us very, very important that we are connecting with civil society and we show them how is it working in your life? What action can you take to be more considerate? In Denmark we have launched, or will launch, the 18th of November, a global program for tech for democracy. As many of our speakers here today have mentioned, in science diplomacy is a delicate way which have a lot of, it can go in many directions and have a lot of opportunities for not supporting democracy. A lot of our tech giants around the world need to be asked if they are progressive and are supporting civil society movement. Or are we facing with science diplomacy a challenge about more surveillance, about capturing our data, which are sold without our knowledge? So there are also huge challenges in science diplomacy that we need to be aware about and address. And I hope that Korea will be able to step up and to look over the back on some of the big tech giants that we in the future develop activities, projects, tech solutions, science solutions, which are for the greater benefit of society. Our Tech for Democracy conference, we hope that we can establish also an event here in Seoul with STEPI and other partners to discuss this important topic about how do we open up when we are doing science for the benefit of society. It is a great honor to be able to represent the Danish Innovation Center in one of the most advanced and innovative country like Korea. I think we have had a lot of very interesting actions or projects, collaboration ideas presented here today. For me, I see definitely that Korea and their the Korean New Green Deal is something which will be our focus point, especially the digitalization element and the tech element. And I think that is where I see ICDK and our Korean partners to be able to lift science diplomacy in action for the future. Thank you so much for your attention.
So let me thank our 5 panelists from foreign embassies to Seoul. Since you are at the forefront of science diplomacy in Korea and across the world, it was a great opportunity for us to hear your valuable opinions, and I think you also raise very important issues that we can talk about in the next group discussion session. So let us now move on to the group discussion. So the 5 panelists will stay with us and invite a couple more experts from Korea for this session. So the group discussion session will be chaired by Mr. Park Hwan-il, Chief Director from the Division of Global Innovation and Research at STEPI. So I'd like to now give the microphone to Mr. Park Hwan-il. Please give him a big hand. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm very honored to be here with you too. So we have 5 panelists from different countries. And these panelists shared your opinions about Korea and your current status of activities in the field of science diplomacy. So it was very informative for me to listen to. So we'd like to continue our discussions in this regard. So in addition to our 5 panelists, I've invited 2 more experts in this field. So let me introduce these 2 experts. To my very left is Mr. Gu Ja-hyun, Director for Knowledge Economy and Research at KDI. And to my left is Professor Yu Jun-gu from Korean National Diplomatic Academy. So for today, I've shared questions prior to this forum today, so we'd like to touch upon each question one by one. And before we talk about the issues regarding the questions that I shared, I'd like to ask some questions that I had from listening to presentations. So first of all, I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Daniel Billing from Australian Embassy in Korea.
So from the presentation, the concept of science diplomacy and the taxonomy. You touched upon these topics. And interministerial work, coordinating this work, and appointing roles. So can you maybe share actual cases from Australia with regards to the governance in science diplomacy? So, between the different ministries, how are the roles divided? And, how do they work? Can you just share that with us?
Thank you for your question.
네, 질문 주셔서 감사합니다.
It's I guess I'd like to step back
네,
from the question and then answer it after doing that. So, as we know, and I think as was briefed by Dr. Beck, a key theatre of the US-China competition is in technology. And both countries seek technology superiority, and we know that many technologies are dual use. So space, quantum, artificial intelligence. So in Australia, because many of the technologies are dual use, and because many of the technologies require a whole of government, a national approach, we have developed national roadmaps or national strategies for the development of those technologies that are in the process of their development involve all the stakeholders' input and are a means by which to bring together the various ministries into a common set of actions. And I guess that's probably the best way to answer the question from the Australian approach, is that we like to approach these technologies in a consultative way and have a national roadmap in terms of how we would address the technologies. And then what happens from the establishment of those national roadmaps is that ministries will create their own missions. So mission-driven research centres or mission-driven research agendas to address the specific questions that relate to each ministry, and there is a lot of sharing of knowledge on that path. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. In Korea, this is also the part that we have question about, and we feel that it's quite difficult, like linking and cooperation among ministries across the government and coming up with a roadmap based on collective efforts and cooperation. That's ideal, but in reality, it's not so easy to achieve. So that's why I asked you this question. And so now my question is for Mr. Gareth Davis. I think this is also similar to the case of Australia. You mentioned that under the Office of Prime Minister, you have Science and Technology Strategy team under the Prime Minister's office. So you have this structure and seeks the collection of opinions pan-national level and pan-government level. So the UK has long been pursuing science diplomacy. So these inter-ministerial cooperation and governance, how does this work? And does it actually work well in terms of inter-ministerial cooperation? Can you share your idea on this?
It's an excellent question, that one, because it's never a perfect world in any country, I think it's fair to say. I think there's a couple of very important couple of very important structures there, which isn't necessarily that particular office that you mentioned. I talked before about the chief scientific advisors. A very important thing that happens once a week is all of those chief scientific advisors meet. And it's important to note that these chief scientific advisors, whilst civil servants, are usually 2 to 3 days a week retaining their positions as research scientists or professors at institutions and universities across the country. So these are people who are used to standing up and walking around the corner and talking to somebody else about the subject area that they want to talk about. And so this meeting is really, really valuable when it comes to talking about cross-government issues, cross-government interests, national strategic importance. And I think that's a very important piece of interdisciplinary discussion that happens on a regular basis in London. I think if you look at the work that the Science and Innovation Network does, that I'm part of, we really don't have any limit to who we can talk to at the top of government. When I say, what did I say, top of government, in terms of which government departments that we're talking to. We are not limited to the Foreign Ministry and our Business Ministry, which we are nominally managed by, but we are able to approach and discuss the needs of the bilateral discussions we're having with Korea, for example, with any of those particular ministries. And so that's a very valuable way of being able to address these issues. I think that in direct answer to your question, it's very, very challenging to pull together a formal structure that will deliver what you're looking at. I think there has to be multiple layers of engagement, and it will always be dependent upon the subject area on which you're looking. So, for example, if we look at artificial intelligence, they created a formal interministerial body in order to look at that. So the Office for Artificial Intelligence is both co-owned by our Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. But it reaches out across government to deliver that. And similarly for the Office for Life Sciences, for the Office for Low Emission Vehicles. These are all interdisciplinary government offices that are co-owned and shared by ministries. It's not a simple problem to solve. The only way that you can do it is simply by, setting up the structures as are needed to address the challenge that's being discussed at the time.
Thank you for your answer.
대사관 앤더슨
Next question to Mr. Anders Hector.
With regards to green transition, you presented that a lot in your presentation. So in Sweden, how did the government bring, enterprise participation by companies? Were there any incentives? Because in Korea, companies, to get them to volunteer and participate, it wasn't easy to get them to do that. So I want to hear about Sweden.
I think when it comes to green transition, there is a very clear history narrative. When the government came back from Paris in 2015 with the goal to be carbon neutral by 2050, companies said, come on, we didn't ask for this. Are we the ones that are going to deliver the carbon neutrality? We are pretty polluting. Look at steel and cement and transportation and everything. So the companies asked themselves, what do we need to do today in order to be carbon neutral by 2050? And what is the rest of the world going to do? Will it be beneficial for us if we do it in 2045 or 2040 or 2030? And they came to the conclusion, some of the companies came to the conclusion that, yeah, this can be a competitive edge for us. So the government, to start implement the job towards these goals, opened for a conversation with companies. And companies came prepared and said, this is what we need in order to deliver what you're asking us. this is what we need the government to do in order to be able to, for you to live up to your promises. And of course, they started working together on the developing roadmaps. So there were 22 vertical industry roadmaps prepared for these industries. They are being translated to government strategies. And individual companies are already moving ahead the goalpost in order to be competitive, to reach what they call fossil-free competitiveness. So they see an innovation edge in it, and they make the objective their own. I know there's different histories in Sweden and in Korea when it comes to relations with companies, but in Sweden it's working pretty well, and it's a very trusting conversation going on. Not everybody are loving each other. You know, companies don't always love the government for different reasons, but it's a respectful relation anyway.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you for your answer. So I can see again that dialogue and understanding, mutual understanding, are very important. Now, among the things that were talked about by Mr. Alexander Renner, you talked about the importance of basic research and also scientific freedom in your remarks. So regarding the investment in basic research, Korea's investment amount is not so small. However, young scientists and researchers are not so incentivized into this area, basic research. So how can we encourage them more? How do you do this in Germany? How do you intensify and encourage young scientists to work on basic research?
It's a difficult question. And I mean, first of all, Germany has an extremely old tradition regarding basic research. This is, I don't know, like in England, probably the both two world-leading countries in this. This is a very, very long tradition. And I would say a young researcher in Germany, it's his aim is to be in basic research, not in applied research or in development. This is a prestigious thing. This is where you can win the Nobel Prize, I don't know. And young researchers, they want to be. It's rather a problem in Germany that researchers do not want to buckle up with the companies so much, but they want to do independent research, looking for the truth, kind of, and not looking for products. This is a very different tradition, probably in Germany, but I think it's important to understand that we also believe that the basis for future innovations and technology developments are laid in basic research. So look, for example, at the Chemistry Nobel Prize this year. It's done at the Max Planck, and it was one from a guy at the Max Planck Institute for cold transition, something like this. And his inventions were extremely important for developing medications against AIDS, for example, and is very important for lower the energy costs in chemical procedures and so on. So this gives Germany, or we believe that this gives Germany the strength to be one of the leading countries in 20, 30 years. We are having a rather long-term strategy in this, and this is very important for us. And when we are looking for partners which want to go this road with us together, a long-term strategy road. And again, I have again to say that it sounds like we do not want to do research with Korea sometimes, but I think the situation in the German embassy is a little bit different. I am, as a science counselor, really responsible for science, and I'm not responsible for connecting companies or something like this. This is done by the German Chamber of Trade and Commerce and Germany Trade and Invest, and we have NRW Invest here, which is the agency of one of the biggest German state, and those people are doing these cooperation projects in the field of the industry. I'm really a science counselor. I'm here for the German science system, for the universities, for the big science institutions like Fraunhofer, Max Planck, and so on. and I can share their opinion or that view with you. Basically, this is I think important to understand. But again, if Korea is kind of an eager country to be fully respected in the world now as one of the G20 countries, and even discussing how can we become part of G7 and so on. And I would say, at least in most European countries, the perspective is to take also over responsibilities in fields like basic science, in fields like social science, in fields like the humanities, that you can contribute to the solving of the problems in the future of the world, and not just doing short-term research. I think this is important to say that very clear, and I know that sometimes people do not want to hear this. And this is that I'm not making friends myself right now, probably, but I think, because I think that Germany and Korea are long-term friends, especially in the field of science. I guess that among, I don't know about Britain, but the close German relationship in the field of science with Korea started already in the 70s, very early. A lot of Koreans came already then back to over to Germany and studied there, and there's a close relationship between these two countries. So this is very important for us to have this close relationship to Korea. But friends talk frankly with each other, and they say what they really believe to each other, and this is why I'm very open in these remarks.
Thank you for your answer.
해주신 내용과
Yes, I would like to ask now from Denmark, Mr. Peter Vingsbo. I know that there are very active climate change partnerships, but the Innovation Center Denmark in Seoul, what is the main focus of this center? What areas do you focus on?
Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to explain a little bit more what we are doing. The Innovation Center actually funded by the Higher Ministry of Education and Research in Denmark. And in Denmark, we have launched the first green research strategy, where we, together with all our researchers, but also our private sectors, are developing roadmaps for 4 specific focus areas: hydrogen transition, circular economy, smart agriculture, and urban cities. So these are the 4 areas that we are working with. One of the concrete projects that we are doing here in Seoul is a very new project with Seoul Housing, with Korea University, where we have established in Margok an urban living lab. The Margok site is located next to Gimpo Airport. It's located next to a sewage treatment plant. There is both a lot of air pollution, a lot of odor, a lot of different challenges in this neighborhood. So we're using this living lab on how we can actually mitigate some of these environmental components. How can we reduce the NOx level from the airport? How can we mitigate some of the odor component from the sewage treatment? We do that in public-private partnerships with the airport, with the utility companies. We're using our science knowledge around enzymes to try to congest some of the wastewater. We are trying to use coating material to reduce NOx. So we, in Innovation Center Denmark, we focus on the challenge which are here in Korea. There are, of course, many challenges that we can address. One of them is around air pollution. How can we actually improve air quality here in Korea? We can do it, as I mentioned previously, with our project with the energy schools. If we energy retrofit public institutions here in Korea, we lower the energy consumption. When we lower the energy consumption, we reduce energy production. We reduce air pollution emitting from coal power plants. So smart agriculture, circular economy, hydrogen transition, and the urban sphere is what we are working together with. And we are working also with our Nordic neighbors with other embassies on specific topics. We have created a communication platform here in Korea called Nordic Talk Korea, where we address, like Alexander was mentioned, some of the more challenges topics like rights, equal rights for different type of gender relationships, but also how do we use artificial intelligence for the benefit of society. You name it, all topics have been discussed in Nordic Talk Korea. And we are always searching after more partners, more projects, and the core of our activity is that what we do need to benefit Korea, and it needs to create partnerships, science diplomacy partnerships. So what we do in Innovation Center Denmark is science diplomacy in action. Thank you.
예,
So thank you to our 5 panelists for answering my rather difficult questions. Thank you for your kind answers. So I shared with you 3 questions prior to this forum. So the first question is, how innovative technology affects the establishment of national innovative competitiveness? And the second question is how Korea should build its global network to secure innovative competitiveness. And the third question is, as for Korea's science and technology diplomacy, what are the implications and policy responses that you can share? So for these questions, we'd like to talk about one by one. We have about 35 minutes left. So the first question, the impact of innovative technology on the establishment of national innovative competitiveness. So I'd like to give this question to 2 experts from Korea, and then I would like to ask our 5 panelists to freely answer this question if you have any opinions. So first of all, I'd like to give microphone to Professor Gu Jahyun. Hi, my name is Gu Jahyun from KDI. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to be part of this forum today. I am doing research on somewhat different area with with all of you. Most of you seem to be involved in science diplomacy, but myself, I am working on industry research and technology, industry technology. So I learned a lot from your presentations. So I work closely with the Ministry of Finance. So regarding this question of how technology can impact the establishment of national innovative competitiveness, I also learned a lot from your presentations. So as for the relationship between securing innovative technology and national competitiveness, I gave thoughts to this. So at KDI, we deal with a lot of issues related to national competitiveness. So there are many factors that can define a country's competitiveness. But the World Economic Forum cited 4 different factors: stability of the macroeconomy, social infrastructure, in other words, enabling environment, and market development, human capital, as well as innovation ecosystem. And as for the innovation ecosystem, the WEF talked about the number of disruptive companies and also the R&D expenditures, as well as the number of scientific publications and their citations, and also the number of patent applications. So in this regard, as our German counselor mentioned, Korea has made active efforts in this regard. So Korea is ranked 6th, which is reasonably high in the ranking. But as mentioned by Mr. the German counselor, we actually invested a lot in applied research as well, but we aim to focus more on basic research as well and also make relevant investments in this regard. So in the process of industrial development, Korea has received a lot from countries around the world. So we aim to return the favor and efforts as well to other countries. So now I'd like to ask Professor Eugene Gu.
Yes, thank you for hosting such an important forum and for the opportunity to speak. So I heard all the presentations, and I think one commonality is that national competitiveness is very comprehensive, it seems. So right now, when we discuss national competitiveness, science diplomacy is science and technology is important, compared to in defense, national security. Yes, it seems science and technology is now almost as important. So innovative technology and new technologies will have a significant impact on national competitiveness going forward, and it will be increasingly so. All the different panelists discussed, politics, the society and economics and its impact on national competitiveness. So now we want to look at, its impact going forward, in terms of technical neutrality. I think that will make it a little bit more of a complex dialogue because there are going to be benefits from technological advance, but also side effects of technological advances, and we need to take them both into consideration to enhance our competitiveness.
Thank you. So unlike in the past, science, technology in nowadays is at the center of national strategies and development directions. So it's, in other words, we can say science technology is the mainstream of government strategies. So acquiring the capability in science technology is essential for a country's national competitiveness. So for this question, do you have any opinions to share with us?
I do. Thank you. That was very interesting perspectives to hear. I do have a comment, which is that Korea is really a model when it comes to making use of innovative technologies, or has been a model, and have been really good in the areas like semiconductors and automotive and some other areas as well, like moving ahead on hydrogen and building infrastructure for that, also hoping for being able to produce technology that will be asked for by consumers around the world. Also robotics is another such area. But those are following a logic of yesterday in some sense, because it's a hope for growth engines, which is a matter of producing a lot of stuff and hiring a lot of people. It's a bet, and it can fall out well, or it may not fall out well. Yeah, I think Korea would benefit from adding to that things that are more disruptive, that are more creatively new. And for that, I think, like my colleague from Germany said, more betting on basic science, basic research is probably needed. And I was very curious, Professor, by your question when you asked about basic science, because it implied that Korean researchers do not want to work with basic research, and I would be interested to know about that. So I'm putting a question back to you, sir, if that's actually the case, if Korean researchers aren't interested in doing that. Thank you.
May I add something as well? If you talk about competitiveness, it's important to keep in mind that's not just technology. Facebook was in the beginning not a technology. Amazon was in the beginning not a technology. And if you just always ask for technology solutions and not how society, how cultural changes of the digitalization and so on affect people, affect our common future, I would second Anders, then you lose track to things what's really happening now. It's happening more than technology development right now in the world. And it's important to have strong researchers in all fields of science to keep track of this, to have international exchange about this, what's happening really there. It's not just ethics in AI, it's ethics in a lot of things. It's arts what's changing. And you should be more believing in yourself. I mean, you're a strong nation. You have a big impact on culture in the world right now. Probably one of the biggest with BTS and Squid Game and I don't know what to name. There's so much things in here, but in the field of science, you're not really interested in these phenomena, what's happening there. And this makes it extremely difficult for an intellectual exchange about these topics. But I'm really interested in the answer of the question which was asked by Anders. I think that's the more important question. Thank you.
Can I also just add an additional couple of thoughts to that? And this is a personal opinion and a personal observation over 10 years of working in this area, I find that there is an interesting focus on the metrics and the measurement of how Korea can be seen as succeeding globally, that I don't think necessarily is helping the development of Korean science and technology, and perhaps potentially could even hinder where you would like to develop your science diplomacy. So, of course, it's very nice to be at the top of global league tables. South Korea right now, number 5 in the Global Innovation Index. UK, of course, in number 4. It's very nice to be able to say things like this, but ultimately, does it really mean much? It's a number on a page which we can use in statistics in our PowerPoint presentations. It's very nice to have. I think ultimately one of the most important things that I have noticed is, and Alex mentioned scientific freedom. Scientific freedom just isn't just people being able to do the research that they want to do, but it's also to have the time to do the research that they want to do, and to some extent disengage scientific strategy actually from political strategy. So in the UK we have something which we've had for many. It's a concept. It's called the Haldane Principle, and the Haldane Principle it's a concept over 100 years old, that government should not have influence on scientific development, because if government has that influence, science doesn't have the freedom to discover what it wants to discover. And I think that part of that here in Korea is perhaps, and if we're wanting to look at the basic science sector in particular and wanting to encourage more knowledge development, because it is technologies that we're fighting over now were developed 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's just that they are market ready now, they are applicable now. You have to create an environment where young scientists and researchers can research what they want, can research it for as long as they want, providing it is peer-reviewed quality research, and that they are able to bring others along with them in order to achieve that. Thank you.
Do you have any opinion, Dr. Koo? So one of the words that I have in mind is whether Korea is an advanced country. So I think about this a lot. So when I look at the questions asked by our panelists, then I can see that Korea seems to have the necessary required capability. But in the global arena, maybe Korea doesn't pay much attention or necessary attention to, for example, to the democratization of science and etc., the issues that are mostly talked about in other advanced countries. Korea used to be one of the poorest countries, only about only several decades ago. But since we started our economic development 70 years ago, this year the UN declared Korea as an advanced country. However, still in people's hearts, we still see our country as a developing country. Still, we have a long way to go. But as pointed out, Korea has achieved significant level of development. And the rankings in terms of indexes are not what matter. Our responsibility and contributions that we make to the international society are what's important, I think. So unlike in the past, this is what we aim to achieve in Korea, and this is also the recognition that we would like to spread throughout the world. And you asked a question. One of the questions was about why young scientists are not encouraged to work on basic research. So usually, applied research is the efforts in applied research are led by corporations mostly. So the system and structure is a bit different. So applied research is more about in exports, and also the jobs at companies in the field of applied research are paid better. So this is why many scientists are working on the field of applied research and working for companies. So maybe this is a unique structure that Korea has. So I also hope that Korea's young scientists will be more incentivized to be involved and work in the field of a basic research. So our institute and also Ministry of Finance will also think hard in terms of how we can encourage more young scientists to work in basic research. So I'd like to thank all our panelists for raising the issues. So from the Korean researcher perspective, the issues that were just raised are very meaningful and give us a lot to think about. As Professor Gu explained, during the 5 or so decades, Korea's industry and economy have developed fast, and most of the research was about industrial development. And now we are at a juncture where we need to look at our future. We need to think about our future and which direction we need to head to. So not just industrial development, but also more research is needed in the field of basic research. So we need to allocate more resources in the field of basic research. And from that perspective, European countries and other countries, including the US, we need to seek more active cooperation with the nations around the world. So now we can move on to the second question. This is somewhat related to what we've been discussing. So the second question was how Korea should build our global network to secure innovative competitiveness. That was the second question. So I'd like to invite you to answer this question. So I'd like to give a microphone to Professor Yu.
Yes, so I think the second and third issues are connected, but there are some things that we need to consider. The building of the network, what the scientists play a great role in that. So expert community or consortiums, networks. I'm sure you all agree that this is important. And at a national level, so we need to be able to include science and technology when it comes to important agreements between countries as well. But there are some areas where we are short, and that's first, I think, personal networks, network of talents. And also, how can we build, these networks? Um, but at the same time, what about multilateral aspect? Building of multilateral networks. That's something I think is very urgent, because I know joint R&D is difficult, but that could be pursued. But also everyone that's here today, especially all the diplomats, and I know that you're all like-minded people and from those countries as well, like-minded countries. So, if there is, a network. And if science diplomacy could focus on that, I think that's urgent for now.
Thank you for your answer.
It's a very interesting topic to discuss. I think I am, perhaps I should mention that before working for Innovation Center Denmark, I was working for Global Green Growth Institute, a core Korean organization funded by KOICA, MOFA, the Korean government, to support global partnerships in the less developed countries, really focusing on green growth. How can we develop a sound way for the people with few resources? Also, the Global Climate Fund in Songdo is pushing this agenda. But what I see missing is perhaps a more science approach when we are working with development countries, building up capacity, building up new partnerships in the less developing countries. That can go both ways. I'm extremely inspired by some of the Swedish cities. They are doing twinning collaboration with cities in Southern Africa. They're not just doing it for the benefit of their own, but they are creating unique conversations where they can learn from something from some countries which are having another culture, another methodology to solve a problem. I do believe that we can learn from better collaboration with less developing countries. And I think Korea is really have established these platforms. One of the concrete projects that we are engaged with is with Ghent University in Songdo. They have created this amazing project. It's called a seaweed peace belt project between North and South Korea, working specific on science diplomacy. How can we utilize dialogue with countries which are different from us? And how can we build up knowledge, partnerships, and development? Yeah.
I think that the Korean companies, the big chaebols at least, they are very good internationalized. They have very good international networks. They have their big offices and research parts in all over Europe, in the US probably as well. But I guess there is quite a big problem in parts of the university level, that the research on universities is not really internationalized, and there needs to be, I would guess, more incentives. So it is important that if there is good research, that it is published in international journals which are well known, and so this is creating networks, this is creating that researchers know each other. You have to travel to big conferences and to present your research results. This takes some time to build up that reputation, but I think that in some parts of the research areas, Korea has not invested enough in this in the past. I just heard that on one of the Sky universities, I'm not going to mention which one, there was an evaluation of the Earth Science department, and they have 30 professors there, and in the last 5 years there was one publication in an international journal. And it's Sky University. That simply means there needs, and I guess that the researchers in the universities are good researchers, but seems not much to be much incentives to be active in an international level, that your prestige is meant by internationalization, that you know other famous professors from all over the world, that your university has these connections. There seems to be older tradition of what is important for professors, and this makes it, that may be okay, but this makes internationalization very, very difficult.
I think there's an opportunity for Korea to be very strategic in the way it builds its global network to secure innovative competitiveness. You are now a top 5 investor in R&D and truly world class in many areas. And so taking that strategic lens, you could look at countries that could greatly benefit from your world-class strengths, and that could certainly deliver you some great advantages in regard to science for diplomacy. And then there's another way to look at that, looking at countries where there are complementary strengths, and I think that's the way I approach my work here in Korea. There are many areas where Australia has world-class niche strengths, and they are actually very complementary to some of the areas where Korea is world-class. And by working together in those targeted areas, we can deliver a far better outcome than what we could do alone. So I think it's very important to be strategic about the countries you engage with and why. And ultimately, I think Korea can stand to gain a lot from that approach.
Yeah, thank you. I think Korea is already doing many things really well. I mean, it's not a coincidence that you're number 11 in size of economy and aspiring to the G7 and so on. So what I'm saying now is not a critique, but there are things that I think Korea could do that would make Korea really take a leap forward in being competitive on the global stage, even more so than you already are. And those are things not about doing, but about values. Imagine, for instance, if more Koreans wanted to study abroad, or more researchers wanted to collaborate with in international groups. That would be fantastic. I know the language is considered by many Koreans to be a problem, but come on, you're really good at English, but there is a hesitation to speak it. I don't know how to get over that, if you need to take drugs or how to get over that problem. But you're really good at speaking English, so you shouldn't hide it. Don't be shy. Another thing is there needs to be a multitude. And imagine if more kids didn't just want to go to the very recognized brand universities in the United States, but wanted to go to other countries as well. Many other countries, many other maybe less known universities that doesn't impress the same way when you put it on the CV, but it will give them fantastic experiences that they will have for the rest of their lives. And a third is about growing together. So in the openness that Sweden has when it comes to science and innovation, growing together is a fundamental value to us. And there are, I'll be perfectly honest and say that there are occasions in my experience here in Korea when Korean technology areas have been wanting to collaborate, but the Swedish partners have said no thank you, because there have been a history of not growing together, but rather taking and running, not in a criminal way, but in a non-sharing way. So building trust by showing that we want to grow together and believing that we can grow together. It's not a zero-sum game where one is winning and the other has to lose. It's a multitude game. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So Professor Gu? So When I take the later turn in answering a question, one of the burdens is that all the good points were already mentioned in previous remarks. So I'd like to take a different lens or different angle. So COVID-19 is a biggest challenge and giving a lot of challenges to countries around the world. But in another aspect, one good benefit, if I have to mention it, then it's revealing the importance of ICT and the use of technology. So one of the challenges regarding network is that location and also the language. So the best way to hang out with is to face meeting in person, but we do now have a lot of tools that allow us to meet virtually. So we are seeing and feeling less and less difficulty in communicating virtually. So if we continue using these tools, I believe that Korea can benefit from the use of technology in the future in seeking collaboration and alliances with other countries. And English is not our mother tongue for Korean people. However, if we actively use digital technology, that can be one way to overcome our language barrier. So one program that we have at Steffi is that we have this knowledge sharing program, which is co-run by the Ministry of Finance. So this program is about sharing our knowledge and expertise in the field of science and technology. So this can be one way to build network with other countries. So for this issue, STEPI will for sure work more on this issue. Thank you. We talked about various ideas in terms of how Korea can seek a network and build a global network in science diplomacy and technology. So I could see that you all have a very good understanding of the situation of Korea. So we'd like to actually summarize and think about what was discussed and share with you later. So the last talking point that I'd like to discuss with you is that, so in terms of governance, I think the countries that are present here have very good structure in terms of science diplomacy governance. You have pan-government governance structure, so many different agencies or government ministries work together for science diplomacy, but I don't think Korea has reached that level yet. So in Korea, ministry have their own roles and responsibilities, but in terms of a comprehensive structure and closer cooperation, we are not there yet. So this leads me to ask the last question. So what are the So in terms of governance, do you have any suggestions that you'd like to make for Korea's governance structure in terms of science diplomacy and innovation? So anyone who is ready to give answer, please go ahead. Or Professor Yu, you can start.
Yes. So the idea of governance, if we look at that from an organizational system point of view, I think things that are same and different, it's different. And what I mean by that is US, Japan, or European countries with longer histories, there are some similarities and there are differences. So, there are three, governances, right? National, control tower, and then ministry focused policy, and then we have metaverse format as well. I think in Korea we need all three actually, to some extent, and that's I think different than the U.S. But because of that, we need a control tower for interagency, information exchange. That's urgent as well. And then for specific substances and topics, then different agencies need to look at that as well. So we need all three aspects together, not separately. And with regards to the agenda, as we saw in this pandemic, there were achievements and limitations in science diplomacy that were revealed by the pandemic, not just in Korea but worldwide. So when we have a specific issue, climate science diplomacy at a global level, whether it be climate change or whatnot, I think Korea, from a more comprehensive point of view, is looking at the direction of science diplomacy through our own platforms and forums. And so if Korea could do that, I think we need that capacity building as well.
Thank you for that answer.
I think for some of us at the embassies to answer, because we could get ourselves in trouble, but here it goes. I think the two words that I would like to use that I could think are opportunities for Korea here, one is continuity, and the second is consolidation. And I'll start with the second one first. When I first started to understand and appreciate the breadth and wealth of the Korean innovation system in particular, it was very clear there was an institute for everything. There was a ministry with a clearly defined responsibility towards how it would support that. And it's a very decentralized system in many ways. And because of that decentralization, it's difficult for those different pieces of the system to talk to each other. Now, I'm not saying that there is a magic ministry created that wraps all of that up together. That's not my job. That will take future Korean leaders. That's their job to take that forward. But I think some sort of effort, structure, mechanism that consolidates in some fashion all of that rather disaggregated activity. And this is really important because we're no longer in many ways in a world of pure sciences. We're in a world of needing to look down between the cracks of subjects, or by bringing disparate subjects together in order to find interesting solutions. So without those sorts of structures, those sorts of discoveries are really rather difficult. I would just like to say this is my personal opinion and not the opinion of the British government. I think the second one is continuity. And I think that I've heard time and time again, and again, this is not just an issue here, this is an issue in other countries as well, but I've heard many stories from researchers here in Korea who have really interesting research that has really interesting potential, but the longevity of the funding programs, the evaluation systems for those funding programs means that sometimes these really interesting projects are brought to a little bit of a premature end, and they're not necessarily allowed to reach what they could have reached. And this is something that can be perhaps experienced, and with March, for example, and the presidential election in mind, it's quite rare to see research projects survive across a change in government administration. And in fairness, that's probably quite common in lots of different places. I'm not saying it's perfectly achieved other places. But I think that if there's an opportunity for Korea to look at those two aspects of continuity and consolidation, I think that these are tricky subjects for all countries, but I think that that's something which, if Korea addresses, it's going to be very interesting.
I would like to add 2 points. The one is that you have to, I would suggest to have more trust in your scientists, that they know how to set up international research projects, how to design these projects so that they are bring the best benefits in a scientific term. My impression is that these things are very, very much they are top down from the ministries, these international projects. This makes it extremely slow sometimes, which is very unattractive for German researchers sometimes, because it takes too long until the funding in Korea is organized, because someone in the ministry is controlling really everything, every question. May there be an information flow from Korea to Germany? How many information flows from Germany to Korea? And this is steered between two like-minded countries like Germany and Korea. The steering of this is unbelievable. This is very unattractive for German research organizations. And think bigger. A lot of these projects for internationalization, at least for a rather big country like Germany, are designed very, very small. For example, the German Ministry for Research and Science and the German Ministry for Economic Affairs developed together a program for the hydrogen economy, about 2 billion euros for international research outside the EU. 2 billion euros. And then we have to discuss in Korea projects of the size of 200,000 euros. This is too small to be administrative for the big countries. This is really, you have to think bigger, you have to put more money on the scale to say, we believe that international cooperation is good. We believe that our scientists will develop jointly, as Anders explained, is together with other countries, good projects, and that this will foster the hydrogen economy in Korea and Germany or Sweden or whatsoever. I think this is very, very important. At least for the bigger countries like Germany, the scaling of the international calls is too small. And let me add this one thing, the DFG, it's maybe comparable to the NIF here in Korea. In Germany, this is a self-governed body by the scientists. This is not state-steered. They just get the money from the state. They decide on, but the scientists decide on where the money is spent for. They stopped a few years ago the cooperation with Korea just because of these two problems. That it takes too long to develop a program, and then these programs are very, very small. Now they give the thing now a second try right now, and I hope that things are developing better, but that would be very, very helpful.
I'd like to speak briefly about the importance of professional competencies in science diplomacy. This is a point that I've come to realize in my posting here in Korea. You have diplomats who work in science policy, so they're formally trained as diplomats, but they're working in science policy. And then you have scientists like myself, I've got a background in artificial intelligence, who work in a diplomatic role. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but all I'm saying is that it takes a number of years to acquire the skills necessary to be able to work effectively as a science counselor in a foreign mission, in my personal view. I've been here in Korea now for 2.5 years, and I think I am now really starting to understand how to effectively implement my role. So from a policy response, if Korea chooses to expand its global network of science counselors, then my recommendation is you must invest in the people that are your agents or your people that you post in those foreign nations so they can deliver effective results for your country.
Yeah, just I agree with that, and the rotation system is good, but it can also be challenging. And I'm also thinking of what the government is being measured by. Of course, politically, they're measured by the people in general elections. That's the one coming up. But what are the parliamentarians asking for in the audits that they're doing in every October, for instance? If they're asking for results all the time, and the results should be connected to patents or something concrete, that will drive institutions in that direction, or is driving the institutions in that direction. And basic research will, and explorative and curiosity-driven research is not going to get the oxygen that it probably needs. Thank you.
If I can just add the last comment, looking into Horizon Europe, the FP7 framework, previous FP7 framework, I see that there are a lot of interest for European researchers to collaborate with Korea, and that is the magnitude we are talking about, which are needed here in Korea. I see that there are even a larger increase of European Korean joint projects. So it's a clear indication from the EU Commission that they can see that what you are standing on here in Korea is something unique. You have skills. You have tested other things which we don't have developed, as like the 5G network, like a lot of things. And I see with the Korean New Deal that framework, that investment framework, is something which are attracting a lot of researchers from Europe. But it's not been mentioned so specific that the Korean New Deal should foster science collaboration. And that's something I would like to see in the future.
네, 오늘
So with 5 representatives from embassies in Korea and with Korean experts, we talked about how Korea should be headed to, and I'd like to thank you all once again for your kind explanations and also for sharing your thoughts with us today. So for a long time, we in Korea have maintained closer relationships with the countries that are present here. So we will continue that way in the future. So we'd like to suggest creating these opportunities together to seek closer cooperation going forward, especially in the field of science diplomacy. So thank you all for your participation, and this ends the group discussion session for today. Thank you for chairing the group discussion session, Mr. Park Hwan-il, and 2 experts, Mr. Koo Ja-hyun and Professor Yu, and all the panelists. So all the discussions that we had today will be a very great starting point for us to continue more constructive discussions and discourse going forward. Today's forum is especially meaningful because not only because it's the 444th forum, but especially because we have the presence of representatives from foreign embassies in Korea. And especially we talked about science in diplomacy and science for diplomacy. So I believe this was a great opportunity to bring our discussion to the next level. So thank you very much for your participation till the end of our forum. So this ends 444th Science and Technology Policy Forum. Thank you.